Hi everyone, and welcome to Brain Fruits, the podcast from women changemakers. You can listen to Brain Fruits on all major streaming platforms, Apple Podcast, YouTube, and Spotify. I'm your host, Hannah Becker, and today I have the great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Hartini Zainundin.
Hartini is a child activist in Malaysia. She's currently a consultant for a local humanitarian organization. She was the Southeast Asia focal person for a UN organization, and she's also the co-founder of Yayasan Chow Kit, an NGO in Malaysia addressing child rights and protecting through services in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Hartini was also a member of the Ministry of Women, Family and Community Development's National Advisory Council on the Welfare and Protection of Children. She's worked closely with UNHCR and UNICEF Malaysia, and has done training here in Malaysia for the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency on the issue of baby selling. Today, we're going to talk about the topic of how to build resilient factors to prevent child trafficking, a hope for tomorrow's economy. Welcome, Dr. Zainundin. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Hannah. It's a pleasure being here and to have this opportunity to speak about an issue that's really close to my heart. So thank you again.
Hartini, a person is a person no matter how small. This is a quote by Dr. Seuss. You're a child activist and a collector of quotes. Can you walk us through your journey to become so passionate about children's rights?
Well, yeah, sure. I guess a little bit of my history then, because it's very much a part of my journey and how I got into child rights. I basically had one of those happy childhoods growing up where you can actually cycle around the neighborhood and play with my cousins and sisters and friends and stuff, and we could go wandering around and pretend we were adventurers on an adventure. We were safe. Nobody would, we never thought the day that anybody would, a stranger could come up and just sweep us off, on their motorcycle or in their cars or kidnap us. It was not like that growing up in the 60s and 70s. And so for me, I just assumed then growing up that all children had that kind of happy childhood, right? With imagination and, a loving family and enough to eat and shelter and roof over your head. And then, of course, then you start reading the newspapers at that time, because obviously there was no YouTube and social media. And so it was a lot of reading the newspapers and finding out that there was a whole different world out there, a big world, and it wasn't all about happy memories in childhood. And so by the time I went to the United States to go to school, university, I was already volunteering in soup kitchens and shelters. And when you see what's happening to children, and I found out very, very quickly, just, volunteering every weekend and doing different things because I wanted to know how different life was for so many. And then, of course, I worked for a not-for-profit organization in New York, working with the lowest performing kids in the lowest performing schools around the 5 boroughs of New York, and in this after school arts educational program where you meet some of the toughest kids living and working and going to school in some of the toughest neighborhoods, I think, in the world, whether it's the Bronx or Hunts Point or Bed-Stuy or Jamaica, Queens, or even outside of New York and stuff. And you get to know the kids and you hang out with them so much because, you're working on a project and you have, certain goals to achieve over 3 months and 6 months, and you work with them every day and you get to know their lives, and their lives are hard. And so, for me, it was more of a practical thing where because I knew the kids, I knew their families, I knew what the gaps were. And then, of course, when you start working with kids, in these schools who don't really have families and they have foster care, and you talk to the social workers, so you get exposed to this whole different world of trying to find practical solutions to just get them to cope. It wasn't even long-term solutions. It was really starting out with practical sort of coping mechanisms to just get them through the day. So whether it was, finding time or sitting quietly to do their homework, to going with them to court, or trying to figure out how to deal with tantrums and finding out the trauma they were going through.
Yeah.
And talking to the social workers, then you realize these kids were hurting, some of them. So I think I was inspired more by the children and the fact that I had something to compare it to. And it didn't have to be, living in Malaysia or stuff. The needs were the same everywhere. The right to food, the right to school, the right to a happy childhood, not being abandoned, not being beaten, not being sold. It was really about addressing basic needs and seeing the gaps in systems that did not protect or uphold the rights of children. And that's how I became a child activist, and that's how it started. But yeah, it started with me being a child.
Wow.
Right? This is not the same for everyone. It's like we all have, So
it's a very, very inspirational story. And as you say, like having worked with all these kids in New York, seeing how they struggle with life and having had such a good background and such a good infrastructure provided must have been quite a shock sometimes. I can imagine.
It was. Some of the kids so my boss was called Mary Poppins, and I was Mary Poppins' assistant. And it was really telling, because we obviously came from such sheltered backgrounds, and the kids thought it was funny that we would come in and want to do good, and then they thought we were going to leave. And that was the most important lesson, that these kids have had so many promises broken, so many people coming in and out of their lives wanting to do good, that you had to build something where it lasted.
Yeah, maybe to give a little bit of context where we talk about child trafficking. Trafficking of children is a form of human trafficking and is defined by the United Nations as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, and or receipt kidnapping of a child for the purpose of slavery, forced labor, and exploitation.
Yes.
If we look a little bit at some numbers, we know that in the period from 2010 to 2012, 16% of the total number of registered victims of trafficking in human beings were below the age of 18.
Yeah.
13% of those are girls and only 3% are boys.
Yeah.
What are some of the biggest problems that you can see when it comes to trying to prevent child trafficking?
Well, first off, let me just give you a little bit more of numbers. So of all the cases of human trafficking in the world, you mentioned child trafficking. We have the sexual exploitation of children, and then we obviously have the commercial exploitation of children, which includes forced labor, organ harvesting, and begging. So for sexual exploitation, which forms about 76% of all the cases of trafficking in the world, the numbers are something like 2.2 million children, just to give you that are trafficked a year, for sexual exploitation. And yes, most of them are girls for a number of reasons. Number one, the lack of education and access to education, and that sense of keeping kids and girls in school. Number two, the whole adage of girls belong in the kitchen and boys are seen as the breadwinners. So they tend to be the sort of this cultural, historical, regional way of looking at how excluded girls are, like I said, and women are. And the fact that there is still this idea that women and girls are not contributors, are not big contributors to the development of any society or to the economic development, and that they are deliberately, I think, in many ways excluded because also of poverty, because of that lack of education, because of historical and religious and cultural context. So this is what we're up against: vulnerable young girls who are not educated or left out, poverty, cultural and religious differences. Going back to the definition again about the work that I'm involved with. So we have the trafficking of children for sexual exploitation, which includes child prostitution, child pornography, and sexual child sex tourism, right? Where people come in and they have sex with girls and they leave. And so, for the longest time, as in many, many countries in this part of the world, the authorities find it reluctant to admit that there is an issue with child trafficking for sexual exploitation. In Malaysia, in particular, we don't recognize the rights of refugees and stateless and people who are foreigners, and we tend to throw everybody into one large group and throw them in detention for immigration violation is also an issue because we don't know exactly how many numbers of refugees, stateless people with no documents, migrants who are overstayed are being trafficked. So the numbers are much higher.
We can see some of the, if we look at some of the reports recently, it really shows that there are two crucial individual factors that lead to child trafficking. One of them is the history of abuse and a vulnerable emotional state.
Yeah.
Another factor, despite this history of abuse and vulnerable emotional state, is poverty. How can we build emotional resilience and facilitate access to education so that children of any background can thrive?
Well, I think there's a number of ways. I think the pandemic and the restriction movement because of COVID-19 has sort of highlighted the I guess, flaws in our educational system, and sort of pointed out again the need to ensure that all children have access to education in some form. And I think it's a perfect opportunity to sort of also create new content and curriculum, online classes and stuff, to ensure that these girls and women and children actually have access in some way or form. So you can have YouTube channels, links to YouTube channels to sort of direct girls and stuff to empowerment classes and self-esteem. That's one. Number two, of course, formal and informal education tracks, whether it's homeschooling or access to government schools, or enrichment classes. I think these are all ways. Self-esteem classes is one thing, and about the fact that you don't fall in love with the first person who says I love you, right?
Yeah. You have been working now as an advisor for the UN and other NGOs. Can you provide us with some insights into how to address these structural factors to overcome discrimination against women and children particularly?
My daughter was asking me last night, she's like, what is a feminist? And I'm trying to explain to her what a feminist is. And, and I'm sitting here going, I shouldn't be having this conversation with you alone. Yes, I'm a parent, but that it's not a bad word to be a feminist, that it's not, feminism is not a bad thing. And it's about empowerment and knowledge and sharing all these different things, right? And it's not about burning your bra in the 1970s. I mean, there's a lot more to it.
Yeah.
When you say they matter, when you say they're a priority, then they're not going to be so vulnerable. And then you bring in the self-esteem classes and the confidence classes and stuff, then girls can take care of each other and take care of themselves, right? And they're not so easily manipulated as well. And this is what I think resilience is all about, right? It's being prepared, knowing what to do, and having a support service. And there's no point telling girls to run, tell and stuff if someone touches you inappropriately, if this community and your parents and society doesn't support you. And that we don't explain to girls, like I said, and I talked about sex, the need for sex education to explain what's going on, right? Whether it's the biological, criminal, the chemistry makeup, or what is it that's going on, your hormones, or whatever it is, right? And that it's natural to fall in love and have crushes and all these things, but you don't run off and have sex with them, and you definitely don't follow them to Bangkok, right? So there's loads of different things, about protecting yourself, right? And if these girls and young women don't have the tools to be able to empower themselves, we're in very big trouble. And this is why the cases are so high, You
have also been the founder of Yayasan Chow Kit. How do you build a social entrepreneurship and get funding for such a delicate topic as child trafficking?
Okay, so the way to address trafficking is obviously now not to just talk about the fact that we're dealing with the issue on trafficking, but looking at the root of the issue.
Yeah.
So it is poverty, it is access to education, it is about citizenship, it is about looking at alternatives in terms of providing shelters for kids in trouble. It is about looking at alternative care, community care, and it is about responsibility. So looking at all these things, I talked about alternative community care shelters. So we're looking at foster care for children. So runaways is one of the things. Baby dumping is another. We offer access to basic needs, like what we were talking about. You need basic needs to survive, but now it cannot just be about surviving. It's about thriving and building that resilience, right? So it's access to health services. So we're setting up I'm trying to set up sort of an impact investment approach business model to access to health services for all kids. Mm-hmm. We're also looking at, we do education. I said homeschooling for kids who have no access to government schools, sort of building alternative tracks, life skills till 30. We're looking at foster care. Like I said, we are looking at food security. So we used to have a soup kitchen for children, but now all our centers are closed because of restricted movement. So looking at ways for kids to sort of work with the young women and single mothers in the area, because we have such high numbers.
Wow, that's, I think, a really great call to action here, because, you know, with Brain Foods, we talk a lot about problem solving. So we take a given problem that we have and see from different aspects how this problem can be framed, what the problem really is, and how it can be addressed. And I really love that you say, you know, it's about figuring out what the root cause really is. And that is this access to basic human needs. So it is access to education, to healthcare services, to classes on emotional resilience. And these are things that you can take action on. So this is really a call for action for all those social entrepreneurs out there to address one of these.
So I think social entrepreneurship, impact investments are the buzzwords now for a lot of the things. And also in terms of looking at doing advocacy and fundraising and collecting data, you know, whether you're creating this data repository or whatever it is that we're doing, I think it's very important that we include the children and young girls and women, the mothers as well, to be able to contribute to this, I think, very rich data in coming up with solutions as well, and sort of documenting it as well. And I think this is the only way right now that we can solve, I think, three things. One is pivoting the work that we do in child protection, building that resilience, because that is the end goal. And number three, sort of proving to donors and investors that we can do things differently. And it's not the same traditional NGO needing donors and funds, but it's really about addressing an issue and doing it together, collaborating.
Yeah.
So
that's the point I love about social entrepreneurship. It's like, you know, it's about financial viability in the end. Like, you address a problem, you do something for society, but you also have to have this business acumen.
There's no traditional donor base anymore. Everything's gone because we've so many in need.
Hartini, getting a bit more personal, we can all like hear your passion and see your passion as a child activist, and it's really inspirational to see that. What are some of the challenges that you encounter working as a child activist, and how do you deal with them?
I eat a lot of cupcakes. Seriously, one of the biggest challenges is the xenophobia that we're facing right now. The backlash against anybody who is poor and not Malaysian. That's one of the biggest things. So how do you address the issue on detaining? And so if you're a child trafficking victim, but you're not Malaysian, and you are caught right now with no documents, you're not going to get access to victim support as you would if you were a trafficked victim. You would be seen as a violator and you go straight to the detention centers. And it's been a repeat case over and over again. So that's on a large national scale. So, you know, having to change that narrative, right, and saying immigration violators can also be traffic victims, right? And we need to address this issue. So we're missing out on a lot of data because they won't identify them as traffic victims. That's number one. Or the fact that, you know, all these traffickers have to be punished, but if the traffickers are from the same community, etc., then the whole community is blamed, right? So there's this really warped sense of who is a victim, and we're still stuck there. 15 years later in Malaysia, we're still at victim identification because of this disparity and this need to vilify anyone who's not Malaysian. So that's one. Number two, of course, funding, because we need to feed children, protect them, and it's so difficult during this time. That's always. Number three, I'm looking for, you know, I think one of the biggest challenge is sitting down and finding the time to actually plan strategies and looking at the whole picture, because we're so busy firefighting and addressing basic needs, you know, and intervention type of putting out fires, that we don't have time to do prevention work, we don't have time to plan it, we don't have time to look at the aftercare. So, you know, it's down to I'm trying, okay, my kids will say it's not true, trying to turn the phone off at 6 p.m. so I can sit and think, or reading. You know, I've got like a pile of papers and articles everywhere, just trying to sit down. I've got an iPad I've never used because, I want to sit down and draw things because it's just no time. We're so busy firefighting. So it's that. I think on a policy level, advocacy level, just looking at alternatives to what the current programs are and just mapping out strategy and the need to really, really get to the root causes and doing more prevention work and aftercare and intervention stuff type of the programs.
It must be so difficult to focus on, what is important rather than what is urgent, especially in a field of activism such as if you're a child activist and you care about combating child trafficking, everything is always urgent. And to take a step back from that and really say, okay, but in order for me to really have an impact, it is important that I focus on the quadrant of importance and not all the time on urgency, I can imagine can be very, very difficult.
Yeah. Thus the cupcakes and my bottle of wine in the fridge. So that's my coping mechanism in this reading and, whatever.
Yeah.
Korean dramas. But yeah, that's my coping mechanism. So that's how I deal with it. And, and just trying different avenues to just talk and talk and talk. So yesterday I spent the morning talking to the social welfare department to agree to partner with us to provide free legal aid for children in conflict with the law. But then, of course, there's negotiation, Malaysian children, non-Malaysian children. I'm sitting and going, can it just be all children? So there's like, we will get back to you. So you're having these conversations, which is great, but you're hitting your head against the wall all the time because this need to differentiate, one group for another, girls from boys, etc. and stuff, and priorities, right?
We're coming to the end of our podcast recording today. What would be the recommendation, the brain foods that you would like to pass on to our community of listeners as a takeaway and glimpse of hope for a better economy tomorrow in which we do care for all children of all sizes?
I think the first thing is the motto of our foundation, right? So Yayasan Chow Kit's motto is every child matters, because they do, every single child. And if you look at the issue from a large standpoint, it can get very overwhelming. But if you think of that one child and you put yourself in that shoe, then it's easy to identify the need, because you can just say, what do I need? What did I do? What did my child need?
Yeah.
And if you do that, then you will find that common value and that common caring and need to protect children, because they are the most vulnerable, because there's so much potential, right? And you want to make sure that they get the best possible options, best possible outcomes possible. So that's number one. Number two, child trafficking is a very serious issue. It's actually the second most heinous crime, and that so many children are missing. But we can address the issue, and we can find solutions if we empower the child, if we empower the girls, if we provide them access to education, we provide all these self-support services, we can minimize and narrow the gap, and so that girls and all protect themselves and the numbers will go down. So I think that's very important. Number three, I think that's most important is that every single person in this world, I think, has the best potential to be the best possible version of themselves. And so it's a matter of opportunity, and it's a matter of empowerment as well. And that you can see it everywhere. There are examples of girls who make it, right, and of women who make it and overcoming challenges. And these are the role models in the stories to be able to do it. And the fact that you and I are having this conversation, I think,
exactly.
is a
yeah. As you say, these we need these role models, especially for younger girls that come from deprived backgrounds, to see that there is an alternative to being lured into, a better educational career by some of these child traffickers. So that's a really important thing here to highlight.
Yeah. And the fact that more people are talking about the issue. So when more people talk about issue, it's going to be more noise and more people questioning. So, so
let's make some noise.
We need to make loads of noise, right? I think so. And it does take the entire global village to raise a child. So, there are children, and there are girls, and there are women. And so we need to do better by them, right? So that's my takeaways. I think that's what I would like your audience to know.
Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure to have you as a podcast guest here at Brain Fruits. And I just want to read out this one quote, which you provided also before in one of your TED Talks from Dr. Seuss. And I love Dr. Seuss so much as well. So as a person, no matter how small, don't forget about that.
Yes, exactly.